Hello students, and welcome to another video tutorial on client-side web development. Today we are looking at stage 4 of our developer profiles, and in this stage we are looking at integrating some dynamic CSS and JavaScript using animations and some new JavaScript we haven't seen before. Okay, so let's get started. Students will need the starter code from stage 3, and you can see our developer profile is well laid out. We have responsiveness, and now we can really use JavaScript and CSS together to provide some dynamism to the page. Okay, so the possibilities are endless, but for today we are focusing on this header right here at the top, and the goal is to create a mouse over or hover over effect. When the user hovers over this profile picture, this H1 here, this developer profile, will change. The content will change to a new string, and we are going to use CSS to provide a smooth transition for that. Okay, so it's going to be JavaScript and CSS together. Okay, so let's get started. The first thing I've done with the code is I've placed all of this CSS in our link. So we've done both. We've embedded CSS and we've linked it in through the style sheet here. And what we're actually going to do is get rid of all of our CSS, because this is already in the external style sheet. And so that will give us, and we can just keep the tags. So keep the style opening and closing tags. We're going to add some additional CSS, but for now we want to get rid of that long string of styles, just so we have an easier code base to work from. If you run that, you can see nothing changes because all of that CSS is now in this externally hosted CSS file. Okay. All right, so we're good. So let's get started. Today we're going to start off by focusing on the JavaScript. And in our prior lecture, I don't think we had this script. What this is doing is, you can see on the first line here is we select all the table data cells in our table, do this query selector all, it grabs all the TD tags, and then for each TD tag, we run a function on them where we create a new text node or a child tag that has this Unicode character, which is our bullet point. Okay. And then we prepend that, so as opposed to appending. So appending will add that to the end of the string here, but we prepend it to add to the beginning there. All right. So we're going to actually leave that in there because it gives it a nice look on the page. But now we are going to make some room in our embedded script. So ideally, we do want JavaScript out of the way too, and we can link that in to an external sheet or script, but we're going to just have everything on our page just so we can view it. All right, so let's get started. So there's a few things in JavaScript we need to kind of understand. So a lot of times the first step is creating variables or constants, and a lot of times those constants or variables will equal an element on the page that we grab. Okay, and those constants typically are on the top. So we're going to create some space, and the first constant we're going to create is a profile picture. And we're going to give it as much context as possible, so the user who is looking at the code knows exactly what this variable has in it. And as you may have already guessed, we're going to select on the page our profile picture. So how do we do that? Well, we use this document object through dot notation, and we use a built-in method called getElementById. So if you scroll up to the profile picture in the header, you can see this image has an ID of profile picture, and that's what we want to target here in our JavaScript. So all we write is profile, we need single quotes, profile picture, and we want to match the name of the ID exactly, and then all our statements we end in semicolons and JavaScript. Okay, so we have our profile picture, and next we want our, if we go up, we want our logo. So we want to create an effect where we hover over the profile picture. So we've already selected that, but now we want to select this H1, which has an ID of logo. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, let's see. Logo equals document. We're going to use the same thing, get element by ID, and simply logo. Okay, so we have both elements to work with now. But now we're going to create a new constant, and constants, again, they never change. They remain constant, okay, as opposed to a variable which you can reassign. We're going to create a constant called original text. So what this is basically our logo, our H1, and we're using dot notation, and we have this inner text method that's built in. So as you can imagine, this inner text grabs the value or the string value of the H1, which we have as the logo. So now we have this in this constant here. So you can imagine this original text is now the content of that original text is this developer profile in the header. Okay. The next constant we're going to create is hover text. So this is actually the new text that we're going to append or dynamically create, and this is just going to be welcome to my profile. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit and scroll down, and this is just going to be a simple string, okay, in JavaScript. So in JavaScript we can typically use single quotes or double quotes. It's actually good convention to use double quotes just because sometimes you will need to put quotes inside quotes, and it won't work unless you have single quotes inside double quotes. Okay. All right, so that is done. We have our setup for grabbing the elements and creating, we have our new string here that we want to dynamically append to the header. Okay, so how do we do that? First, there's two steps. So we need an event that captures the mouse over or the hover over this profile picture. And then we also need an event that listens for what's called mouse out. Okay, so in JavaScript we have two events, mouse over and mouse out, that we can utilize to dynamically change things. So what we're going to do is we're going to go profile picture, because that's what we're hovering over and that's what we want to initiate the change. We're going to use this add event listener to listen to the event, which is mouse over. Okay, and with these add event listeners, you can listen to a bunch of different events in JavaScript, one being mouse over, mouse out, on load document, you can listen for or wait until the entire DOM is loaded, on click, which are very common. So as the first argument, you're going to put the actual event, and these are built into JavaScript itself. And the second argument, we have this lambda function or anonymous function that invokes right away. Okay, we call it anonymous just because it doesn't necessarily have a name. It just has these parentheses with this equal sign and right arrow, and then we have our function block. So everything inside this will engage once we hover over the profile picture, and we use dot notation here. Okay, so what do we want to do? So basically, we have to do a few things. So when we put our mouse over the profile picture, it has to disappear. Sorry, it doesn't have to disappear. I stand corrected. So this H1 pretty much has to disappear. And then we have to run, or we have to insert our new string, which is our hover text. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, in JavaScript, we can actually dynamically set CSS values. And how we do that is like this. So we take our H1, which is represented by the logo constant, and we use dot notation and we target the style. So this is actually the CSS styling. And wow, next we can put in, again through dot notation, the actual property of this logo. So the logo will have CSS properties in the document, and we can actually dynamically select those properties and dynamically set those. So we're going to set the opacity, which is, how much you can see it, from 0 to 1, and the range is 0 to 1, and we're going to set it to 0 so you cannot see it. Okay, so on hover over, if you run this, it is gone, right? But we have to do a little bit more because we don't want things just to disappear and nothing to appear. So we're going to keep setting some values. Okay, so one thing we're going to set is an animation property. So in CSS, you have what's called animations. And you can actually set the animation property again in JavaScript. So we're going to equal this to a bounce animation, and we're going to put it to a duration of 3 seconds, and we're going to set this value to infinite, which means it's going to loop infinitely, okay, as long as the user's hovered over the image or the profile image with their mouse. Okay, so that is set. So this bounce is actually defined in the CSS. So we're actually going to define this bounce animation with keyframes. So that's going to be one of our steps in the actual CSS. But for now, we're just going to set it like this. And then the next part is going to be what's called set timeout. So we've actually seen this in class, and set timeout is basically a way to delay things. So we set, there's 2 parts to it. So you have the delay time in milliseconds as the second argument, but the first argument is actually just the function block. So again, we're going to use this notation here of our anonymous function that gets invoked after a certain interval. So the second argument of this set timeout function is actually, we're going to set this to 300 seconds, or milliseconds rather. Okay, so in 300 milliseconds, this function block will invoke, and inside this we can set additional properties or additional actions. Okay. So the set timeout, just to explain, is a built-in method in JavaScript. There's another one called set interval. Very useful for delaying things. A lot of times you need to wait for things, or especially with animations, you set a delay there. So inside here, we're going to grab our H1, which is represented by the logo again, and we're going to use this inner text method to equal it to the hover text that we've set above. Okay, but it's going to be delayed by a bit, the 300 milliseconds, and then we're also going to set the opacity back to 1, to a value of 1. And even though it is an integer, it is a CSS value, so we have to wrap it in quotes. Normally this would be interpreted as a string, but because we're using CSS, we have to wrap it in quotes. Okay. All right, so if you run that and hover over the profile, you can see a new message appear, and that's great, and we can leave it at that. But ideally, when the user's mouse or pointer goes off the profile picture, we want it to go back automatically to this developer profile. Okay, and we can do that using a similar method here. So what we're going to do is copy this code and create some space and paste it, and we'll just format it so it looks nice. I'm just going to get rid of some of this room. And instead of listening to the mouse over, we're going to listen to an event called mouse out. And you can imagine what that does. So it's on mouse out, it's going to do something. And our goal here is to set it back to this original text constant, which is just developer profile. Okay, we want it on mouse out to go back to what it was originally. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set this animation. So on mouse out is actually going to cease the animation. And so we set this to none. We set this animation property to none. So the animation stops in effect. And instead of hover text, we're going to equal it to this original text. Okay, and that's all the changes we make. So if you hover over that and you mouse out of it, you can see that it goes back to the original text that we had before. And this is set by the logo. Okay, perfect. And it's that simple. So this is what makes JavaScript very powerful, is you can affect changes on the CSS. You can create, delete elements on the page. You can set intervals or timeouts to wait for things. There's really no boundary to what you can do as far as dynamically changing things. And that's why JavaScript is so useful for front-end developers, okay? But we're not going to stop there because everything looks nice and we've learned a lot. But we actually have to define this animation. Right now, if you hover over the profile, it will just quickly change over, and that's fine. But we can use CSS to make this transition a lot smoother. Okay, so how do we do that? So what we're going to do is we're going to scroll up to the head, and inside our style tags that are left over from before, we're going to define some things. Okay. All right. The first thing is we're going to target our profile picture. And it's an ID, so we use the hashtag. And we're going to create a property called cursor. And we're going to set this property to pointer. Okay. So what this means essentially is when you hover over it, it's going to be a pointer. Okay. And we're going to use that pointer to activate and deactivate our animation. The next property we're going to look at is called transition. Whoops. Transition. So we use transition to kind of ease things in. So we're going to set this value to transform 0.3 seconds and ease. Okay, so we're going to excuse me, what this is going to do is essentially slow things down. And you can look at the transition property in W3 Schools. You can see there's a few properties you can use to affect these transitions. We're just going to use the first one here. And again, you can use it to affect in many different ways. Okay, you can set the timing to linear, which is consistent, ease in, ease out. You can set a delay. There's quite a bit you can do. So if we go back to our Colab and run it, if you hover over there, it's not going to do anything because that transition right now is, we need to go further, and basically the transition, or the animation rather, is going to be affected on the H1. Okay. All right. So we actually have to use a state change here, which is the hover over effect. So this next one is going to be a profile picture, and we're going to use a colon, and we're going to go hover. Okay, so this is a pseudo class that we affect change on this profile picture. So this is going to engage when we hover over it. We do want to add an effect here where when we hover over this profile picture, it will actually scale up. And how we do that is use this transform property, and we can scale it at 1.1. What that means is it's going to be 1.1% of its original scale. Okay, so if I set it to 1, it would do nothing because it would be 1 of 1. But if you set it anything above that, like 2, it would essentially be 200% of its original scale. And all you can do is run that, and you can see this is now increasing scale. But prior to that, we set this transition to ease, because if we didn't, essentially this would just kind of almost flick really quickly to this larger size, and we want that kind of smooth linear transition. Okay, so that's why we set the transform to ease instead of duration. Okay, so that's good. But now we have to do this H1 because our transition from developer profile to welcome to my profile is just not working. Well, it's working, but it's just we want an effect where it's nice and smooth. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, we can do it with CSS. So this next step is we're going to target the logo now, which is it's kind of misleading. It's our H1, right? So perhaps we could have named that a little bit differently. But we're also going to set the transition here so we have more of a smooth effect. But this time we're going to affect the change on the opacity. So when that new text or that new H1 comes into effect, it's going to be a lot smoother linear transition. Okay, so let's run that. And if you hover over it, we still kind of have the same thing. But we can set the value a little bit higher if you wanted to. But what we're going to do is, oh, excuse me. Oh, sorry, I needed to add an S for seconds. Make sure you have seconds there. And you can see if you run it, it's a lot smoother, just like our image or profile picture scaling up there. So now we have a nice smooth effect there, and you can leave it at that, but I even want to go further with that and use keyframes. So keyframes are a great way to create animations. And the keyframes rules specifies the animation code. So we actually create an animation, a new animation, give it a name, and we can use it anywhere in our CSS. Okay. All right, and it says here we should always define both the 0% and 100%. So basically 0% represents sort of the start of the animation, 100% the end. Okay, and you can see that's written here. Okay, so let's go back and let's use this keyframes rule. And we're going to set it to slide in, because essentially that's what it's going to do. Okay. Actually, you know what? We're going to name it bounce. It doesn't actually bounce, but if you recall here in our JavaScript, if you go down, we set the animation to bounce here in the mouse over event. So this is actually referencing our name of our animation that we're going to create. And you can see on mouse over, as long as that mouse is over the profile picture, it's going to run indefinitely, okay? All right, so let's go up and let's start with, oh, sorry. Let's make sure I have the closing. And we're going to start with the 0%. So that's the beginning of the animation. And what we want to do here is we can affect what's called the transform property, and we use what's called translate, and we can affect the X or Y axes. So basically, at 0% or the beginning of the animation, this animation is going to start at 0. Basically, its default position, so this H1 default position, okay, through the translate X. But now, if I copy this, I can change this to 100 now. Okay, so the end of the animation. And now I want this at 50 pixels. Okay, so I can set that. And you can do values in between like 80%, 50% just to make it easier. Again, these are keyframes, so you're looking at kind of frames inside the animation from beginning to end represented by these percentages. So if you run that and hover over it, you can see this moves in smooth effect to the right. Okay, it takes 3 seconds because if you look at the JavaScript, we've defined the 3 seconds. We have our animation name, 3 seconds, and then it runs infinitely as long as you're over that profile. Okay. All right, and that is actually it there. You can see in the CSS we use a combination of transition and transform to make these transitions nice and smooth. And to do that, you have to target the actual element that you're working on. And then part of that too is actually engaging this animation through the mouse over event that we've defined in the JavaScript. Okay, so I hope you like that. That's it for the Stage 4 Code Lab, adding some dynamic CSS and JavaScript to the page to improve our developer profile. Okay, well, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.